Hello and welcome to round 4 of the Chariot Blossom Open. We saw leading up to this we were coming in with just a 2 out of 3 score, so not a great start. I mean, no disaster. We managed to escape some fairly questionable positions after taking a lot of risk against lower rated players and getting properly punished for it. We did at least manage to escape with 2 draws and 1 win, of course, in the first round. So definitely not a great start. I wasn't feeling super confident going into the second part of this tournament, but we had at least staved off disaster. This could have been a lot worse, and we were only really a game or two from kind of correcting the course. So this was going to be a very important game for setting the tone of the rest of the event, and we had a pretty reasonable pairing for it. White against a 2150 player is in principle a good pairing. I mean, obviously we kind of failed miserably to demonstrate that in round 2, but I felt that we would have a lot better chances to make something happen in this game now that we were a little bit warmed up and had a little bit better idea of how we wanted to play out the opening and kind of the game as a whole. So we ended up playing a very, very interesting game here. My opponent decided to go for an accelerated dragon, which I actually did kind of expect a little bit. This is a player who doesn't play that much nowadays. He's relatively old by chess standards, so he's had like most of the games I could find were very, very, very old. And so I had no idea if he was still going to play this or if this is something that he played a long time ago and now he's moved on to more modern openings, like whatever. But he decided to stick with this, which I did see that he had at least a couple of games in. So I did some cursory review of these lines since it's a very unpopular opening. Very, very few people play it with the black side, but it is still very, 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 very solid, if a bit passive. It kind of fits this more old school style of defending the black pieces, which is just to accept that you're going to be a little bit passive and probably slightly worse. White's going to have a wide variety of things that they can try to play for an advantage, but you just trust that you're going to be able to figure out the details and not let anything get much more than only slightly worse. But I wanted to go for this, and I wasn't sure how up to date he would be in the sort of modern treatments of this opening. So I figured, similar to round 2, I'm just going to play the main lines. I'm not going to let like a 2100, 2200 level player kind of scare me off of playing my repertoire, just because they've played an opening that is reasonable. You know, it's not even like this is one of the better openings. So I figured I would play the main line and make him be the one to deviate. Especially because I wasn't sure if he was going to be 100% familiar with the main lines himself. So we went ahead and played c4, entering the Maroczy bind. Has always been the main treatment of the accelerated dragon. White is taking full control of the d5 square, hence the name the bind, which prevents black from ever playing d5 himself, either after d6 and e6. And d5, you know, black can very, very slowly try to prepare it, but it's going to take a lot of effort to get this move in. And without that, black is never really fully equalizing until he manages to get either d5 in or break from the side, either with b5 or sometimes f5. Much more rare that f5 is possible, but it is also an idea that black can try in certain lines. So already black has basically 2 ways to try to combat this. The battle lines are kind of drawn in that white is always going to permanently have more space because black is not able to play d5, which means that black is generally going to try to trade a couple pairs of pieces as much as possible. Ideally, he'd like to get like 2 sets of pieces off. One is okay, but not necessarily enough to equalize. Generally, if you get 2 sets of pieces off without any major concessions in the meantime, then you're probably fine because the lack of space will be much less of an issue with so few pieces available. And then black is going to play for ideas of breaking down the center, again, either from the side or directly. So black can either start with the move knight f6 or bishop to g7. They lead to slightly different types of positions. In this game, my opponent decided to start with knight to f6. And this is signaling black's intention to just go ahead and take on d4, using the fact that black will be able to play bishop g7 and open up a bit of a discovered attack against the queen, which will also gain a little bit of time, but also get rid of one of the pieces off of the board. This is kind of the old way of playing the position. The other thing that black can do is play bishop g7, and then after bishop e3, knight f6, knight c3. Now, if black does go ahead and take on d4, white has the option of taking back with the bishop, which is it's a more active position for the bishop, which sort of discourages black from taking on d4 in the first place. And so, in fact, black generally doesn't do this. Black generally just goes ahead and develops with d6, brandishing the idea of knight g4, and after f3, there's some lines that continue. But my opponent went for knight f6, which is this old main line. White is forced to play knight c3 to defend the pawn, and now, after d6, we don't have time for bishop e3 because black gets to play the move knight g4, immediately putting the question to this bishop. So white first has to start with bishop e2 to make sure the square is controlled. And now, before we have time to play bishop e3, black goes ahead and takes on d4. Black can also, kind of revert back to bishop g7 if he wants to, which would transpose back into some of the other main lines, most likely. But if you're starting with knight f6, it's generally connected with the idea of taking. So we go ahead and exchange on d4, black plays bishop g7. Now this does brandish the idea of a discovered attack along the long diagonal, but right now the bishop is undefended, so we have a little bit of time as white before we need to deal with that. So we go ahead and play bishop e3, we take advantage of that one move that we have. And now after castles, we can slide the queen back very naturally to d2. So this is the starting position of the knight f6 variation of the accelerated dragon, or of the Maroczy Mind, rather. And white is very comfortable in general. White should have a little bit of an advantage here. Only one pair of pieces has gone off the board, so white is maintaining a very, very serious space advantage, and it's very difficult for black to complete the rest of his development. Specifically, this light square bishop doesn't really have a natural home. Eventually, what white's plan to try to win this position is white will very slowly prepare the move knight to d5, which will introduce a lot of pressure in black's position. This basically means that black will most likely either have to play the move e6 to evict this knight on d5, which makes the d6 pawn a very serious weakness, or go ahead and take on d5 himself, either with the knight or with the bishop if it's planted on e6. And then once black takes on d5, white can either take with the c pawn and try to play with the open c file and slightly better control of the queen side, or he can play e takes and try to generate a kingside attack, often with the two bishops. Generally, taking with the c pawn is much more promising, because these pawns are going to be very difficult for black to hold. And so, for example, if black plays bishop e6 here, which is a very old main line, then after something like castles, rook c8, knight d5, or, well, okay, I guess we should be a little more careful. Let's say b3 first, intending just like rook c1 and knight d5, maybe like a6, rook d1, knight d7, knight d5, like something like this. Not sure about these exact moves, but something like this is a very typical transformation of the position, where now the pawn structure is a little more symmetric. There's no sort of asymmetry anymore, but white has two bishops and very powerful control of the queen side. The space advantage is a little bit irrelevant now because there's only two pieces left, so the nature of the advantage has transformed. But in general, white has pretty reasonable chances of creating a fairly sizable advantage in this sort of position. So my opponent decided to go for the much more modern treatment of this line, which is to begin with the move a5, which looks a bit bizarre if this is the first time you're seeing it. First of all, it's introducing a lot of holes in black's position, both on b5 and b4, or b5 and b6. It's not really clear what this accomplishes. White wasn't really ever going to play b4. But the idea here is there's sort of multiple ideas here. One is that, black needs to find a square for this queen, because it doesn't want to be on d8 forever. In fact, black would like to move this rook to c8 at some moment, and that's going to require this queen to move away. So, one way to do that is to play like bishop e6 and queen d7, but this queen on d7 is also misplaced. It doesn't really accomplish much there. This battery with the queen and the bishop obviously isn't really doing anything, the same way that this battery might be the focal point of some kind of kingside attack. And on d7, it actually blocks in the knight, which would really like to go to d7 and transfer or transfer either to c5 or e5, where it'll put some serious pressure on white's center, and also unleash this Fian Shadow Bishop, which is kind of the pride and joy of black's position right now. So black would generally prefer to avoid putting the queen on d7, but it still needs to get out of the way of the rook on c8. And so typically the queen is actually going to a5 in most of these positions. Mostly just to get out of the way. It doesn't really necessarily accomplish much here, but it does have some purposes. It supports, for example, a6 and b5, which is one way to break down the center. It does introduce some kind of pin here, which is sometimes relevant. You know, it does make it a little bit more difficult. For example, if we castle bishop e6, like, I don't know, if we ever play like bishop d4, or like maybe take on a7 or something, this pin can be potentially annoying. And also, if, you know, we play lackadaisically, now black is kind of brandishing the idea of taking on c3 and ruining white's pawn structure because there's this additional attacker on a5. So black would generally like to put the queen here. One of the problems for black, and the reason that this line, or this doing this idea immediately, has fallen a little bit out of favor, is that white has ideas like playing rook c1, a6, preparing b5, b3, bishop e6, some position like this, and then this move knight a4, which attempts to trade the queens immediately and take advantage of this very serious hole on b6 that's been kind of exposed in the position. I guess actually with like f3 to defend the pawn first, rook c8, and now knight a4. And this has proven to be a very, very serious thorn in black's side. White has a very, very pleasant position. And so the idea of a5 instead of queen a5 is to first secure the position of the queen by playing a5 and a4, which restricts white's idea of playing b3, and only then bringing the queen to a5. So if, for example, f3, a4, castle, queen a5, now this queen is very, very secure here. There's never going to be any knight a4 issue. These squares are not really that easy to take advantage of, and also this queen side, this pawn on a4, can put serious pressure on white's queen side. For example, as this knight moves to d7, then in addition to there being pressure on the c3 knight directly ruining the pawn structure, white can also increase the pressure by playing a3 and removing this defender. So white needs to be very, very active in combating this plan of the queen coming to a5. And one of the modern ways to do this, you know, first of all, rook c1 has always been the main line, and after queen a5, there's a very nice idea of Fabiano Caruana in this position that is kind of taken over as one of the main lines here, if not the main line, which is not the castle, which would be the very natural way to complete white's development entirely, but to play this very subtle looking move king f2, which has a very deep point that is very, like, intuitively it looks a bit weird to put the king here, but there is a very specific purpose, tactically speaking. So to understand this, understand why we go king f2, it's useful to look at castles first, which has been the main line for a long time. Black will now complete his development by putting the bishop on e6, and now black's next move against almost anything is going to be rook c8, putting a lot of pressure on the c4 pawn. Now, one of the big problems for white is that, you know, again, white is never really going to be able to play b3 to shore up this pawn because this pawn on a4 is a very serious problem. And so in general, white is having to play this knight d5 move very early. Probably even here, which is attacking the pawn on e7 and also opening up the exchange of queens. Now, if white has to take on d5, white is very, very happy with this position because this rook on a5 is very, very misplaced. It has no squares along this rank to go to, so it's just kind of stuck. It can also be harassed by either bishop to b6 and bishop to g2. But because this rook is kind of offside, now white has full control of the c-file, and white is basically pre-moving rook c7 against any move that black can play, which is going to end up taking a lot of pawns and probably just winning the game. But very importantly, black has a tactical solution to this problem, which is that black can actually exchange first on d2. And now if we take back, takes, black can very comfortably contest the c-file and shouldn't be any worse. In this position, black will follow up with knight d7, c5, which is another kind of option that's, not quite made available by, but strengthened by this idea of a4, a5, or a5, a4, because now there's no b4 to dislodge the knight. And so black is doing quite comfortably here. In fact, it's probably actually a little bit easier to play black. I don't think black should win this very often or anything, but I wouldn't. It's certainly a very successful outcome for black. So the question is, after queen d2, like, this move shouldn't really be possible because we're taking on e7 with check as an intermezzo. This is a very typical idea in this configuration with the queens on a5 and d2, is to play knight d5 and take advantage of the fact that we can take on e7. So king h8 is forced, it's the only legal move, and now after we take back on d2, white is up what appears to be a very comfortable pawn. But it turns out that the line continues here with rook e8, the knight is almost trapped, has nowhere to go to except back to d5, and now there's this very powerful pin on the e-file, which allows black to probably not only equalize, but actually be a little bit better in this endgame by recovering the pawn on d5, and now black's pieces are very, very active because this bishop on e2 is hanging. Now you might notice by now, you might be able to guess why we play king f2 then, because if the king were on f2 in this position, this bishop would be defended. There would be no bishop takes d5. And so if we go all the way back here and to king f2, now bishop e6 would actually be a little bit of a mistake from black, because this whole line with knight d5 now suddenly works. After queen takes d2, knight e7, king h8 recaptures the queen. This whole trick with rook e8 doesn't work anymore, and so white is just up a very, very comfortable pawn. And so after king f2, it's important to actually not play bishop e6. It's survivable after bishop e6. It's not like white is much better or anything, but it is a line that white is doing very comfortably in. So my opponent spent a very long time here, which I thought was encouraging because it suggested that he probably wasn't familiar with this idea concretely, but he came up with one of the reasonable solutions, which is instead to put the bishop on d7. And now, after knight d5, if black takes with the knight, then taking back doesn't come with tempo on this bishop. And so, for example, after knight d5, knight takes d5, takes on d5, black is probably fine to even just play like... I wasn't 100% sure during the game if even rook c8 is fine. Takes rook c1 and just rook back to a8, and like if we go to c7, just very calmly king f8. Visually, white looks like he should be a lot better. You know, every piece is basically better than its counterpart, but there is this annoying pressure on b2 that needs to be dealt with. These pieces are sort of stuck, but they will eventually free themselves. I wasn't sure if this was that much of an advantage for black, and also black could even just take on b2, which also needs to be calculated, and I don't think white is really better here at all. So I decided that I would try to improve on this line a little bit. You know, knight d5 is definitely an option. Maybe objectively it's even the best option, but I kind of realized that after bishop d7, black is probably intending to go bishop c6. There's not really any other reason for the bishop to be going to d7, unless, you know, black just wants to play rook c8 and leave the bishop on d7, but that's a very strange square for the bishop. And so I decided I would try to improve on this plan a little bit by beginning with this kind of interesting, very risky, but kind of interesting move, g4, which is aimed at just kind of dislodging this knight from f6 to undermine the support of d5 a little. And if my opponent, for example, now goes bishop e6, and we enter this same line, now this pawn on g4 is actually quite relevant, because typically black would go for knight d7, rook c7, let's say knight c5, rook b1, and then bishop f6 to defend this pawn, if the pawn were back on g2. But now with the pawn on g4, we can actually just play g5, and the bishop's connection to the pawn has been completely severed. In fact, you know, the main line with bishop e6 and this pawn back on g2 is to play g4, even in this position. So I figured that g4 would just possibly just gain a tempo on the main line if black continued with the same plan. And so after bishop c6, I played knight d5 with the same idea in mind, you know, whether it's bishop c6 or bishop e6. If black takes with the bishop, then we reach a tempo-up version of the main line. So I played knight d5, and my opponent is basically forced at this point to come back to d8. Again, black can't take on d2 because of knight takes e7 with check, and white picks up a very clear pawn. And if black takes on d5, then again, he's just down a tempo on the main lines, so queen d8 is basically forced. And here I wasn't quite sure how to continue. I felt that I should... It feels like I've accomplished something, but it's probably not like a huge advantage for white or anything. If we do go for something like g5, then the knight is very comfortably coming to d7, which is the square that it would like to go to anyway. In fact, if we play basically anything here, I think black is basically pre-moving knight d7 against most moves. So I was trying to decide between h4, trying to generate some kind of an attack, and the move that I eventually played, which was bishop to b6, forcing the queen to go to d7 and depriving the knight of that square. The main thing I didn't like about h4 was that after knight d7, h5, black can actually kind of start to counterattack because our king is also very, very loose here with f5, and I had a lot of difficulty evaluating this position. It's just, it's a complete mess, and I have no idea who's mating who, or what's going on here. Also, black can throw an e6 and then f5. It's a very, very risky position for both sides. So I figured that bishop e6 would be a little bit simpler. Now black has to go queen d7 to maintain contact with this pawn, and so now it's less clear what black is supposed to do. Once again, we could go h4. That's legal, but I don't think we're ever really generating an attack here, so I decided to play in the center instead with rook to d1. My opponent played rook f to c8, which is kind of what I was hoping for. It's not really clear what else black does, so I think that rook c8 is like quite reasonable. That is definitely part of black's plan, but I was kind of hoping he'd do it because then if the knight comes to b6, it's like a triple fork now, and so after rook c8, bishop back to e3, he's actually forced to take on d5 with either piece, and he can't actually do it with the knight, because then if he takes, this light square bishop is just trapped, and white wins the game up a piece. So this initiates a bit of a forcing line. After bishop e3, the bishop has to take on d5. C takes d5, and now my opponent played e6, which I'm not sure if this was an overreaction. In the game, I actually expected black to come back to d8 for just preparing knight d7. White's idea is to play like queen b4, bishop b5, and just collect a4, so black does need to be kind of fast. I was expecting just queen d8, intending to get the knight to d7 and then to c5, and I wasn't sure if white is much or any better necessarily here. For example, if we just go ahead and continue this plan, then black can sacrifice a pawn with knight to c5, intending to, well, just get opposite court bishops first of all, but also maybe this isn't even, black might even be able to get away with just trying to recuperate the pawn immediately. But also I thought if there's something like even queen d6 maybe, black is probably surviving. Rook c8 obviously is a much more direct attempt to not even be worse. So realistically, I'm probably not taking on c5 here in any case, and if I take on b7, then the queen starts to feel very uncomfortable here after something simple like, I mean, even this rook to b8, I was going to say maybe not this one because of here, but even this position, with full control of the c-file, black is probably going to collect b2 at the very least and equalize somehow. For example, rook c1, rook b8. The line continues, but I didn't think that... I thought this was probably probably the safest thing for black to do. Because e6 definitely blows open the position quite a lot, which should be good for my two bishops. And so I was very happy to see this move, but it's very, very complicated. So I went ahead and took on e6. Black is pretty much forced to take with the queen, otherwise this pawn is just falling for nothing. Now, I spent quite a lot of time here trying to find the most precise continuation. If we take on d6, seems like we're just kind of winning a pawn. If takes, we're not too unhappy for the bishop to come back. But I was a little bit afraid of what happens if black takes on c1 first, because now we can't take with the rook is needed to defend the queen. If we take with the bishop, then black is taking on a2, and this still looks very, very good for white, but the bishop having to move back to c1, I think it's probably not ideal. And if we take on e6, then black is probably going to take on d1 and try to play the position with 2 rooks against a queen, which I thought also should be good for white, but probably not the most convincing. So I decided instead I should probably take on c8 first to force the issue. Black has to take with the rook, and now we can take on d6. Part of the point here is that after black takes on e2, now the bishop is on a much more active square on e3, and black's pieces are a little bit stuck, so we can force them back even further with e5. The knight has no active squares to go to, so it has to drop all the way back to e8. And now after queen d7, this is the point of drawing the rook out here. We are gaining in tempo by attacking the rook and actually trapping it if it tries to stay somewhere along the 8th rank. For example, after rook b8, we can throw in bishop a7, and the rook is very quickly running out of acceptable squares. So after queen d7, queen e6 is forced to enter what looks like a pretty miserable endgame. But after takes, here I started spending time again, because this is kind of where I stopped my calculation, because I just kind of assumed like f4, like, okay, black has no pieces participating in the game. You know, what is there to be scared of? But I actually got kind of concerned about the move g5 here, and I wasn't really quite sure how to finish this off. Just kind of undermining the center here. And if we play something, you know, kind of obvious, like rook d7, then after takes, knight c7, the knight is coming to d5, and also there's an idea of rook f8. Just trying to put pressure on this bishop, which I thought was pretty concerning. So I spent a lot of time trying to make this work, because this is definitely, I thought, it has to be the correct approach, but I just could not deal with this g5 move at all. And in hindsight, I think that was probably very silly, and I don't think there's actually really a lot of difficulty here. But one line that I was looking at, for example, was, let's say, king f3, takes on f4, takes on f4, knight c7, rook c1, and here I got kind of concerned about rook f8. Something along these lines. Was I scared of it in this position? Maybe I was scared. I'm trying to remember what position I was scared of it in. There was definitely something. Maybe it was with bishop f3 here. But there's like all these ideas where black can actually abandon the knight on c7 and try to pick up e5. Let me try to remember what. Yeah, she was. Yeah, so king f3 was the main move. And then after takes, knight c7. Okay, no, this is what I was concerned about. And then after takes, bishop takes e5, rook c4. I was concerned that black is just getting too many pawns, and I wasn't sure if this is actually winning for white. It turns out it pretty much is not. I mean, it's very close. But the move that I missed here, which is very clever, that the computer just pointed out, but I saw afterwards, is that here I can actually deflect the rook with rook c8. And now after takes, white is very, very clearly close to winning, probably is just winning. These two bishops are very, very powerful, and these pawns are too disconnected to stay alive. White will go just collect everything and probably win the game without too much effort. So I definitely didn't need to be as scared of this as I did, but I got pretty concerned about it, and instead decided, okay, maybe the simpler approach is just to put the bishop on d4. You know, knight c7 still isn't possible because of rook c1, and this pin is very, very annoying. So, you know, we might as well just play this. And if black plays rook c2, which is what he played in the game, then I just play bishop c3, and we go trap the knight, go trap the rook. But what I missed here is this very simple idea that black can actually free the rook with a3, and white is not in time to go collect the rook, because this pawn will be very, very powerful and probably just promote. For example, this is most likely not winning for white, or at least is a very, very difficult conversion. So my opponent played rook c2 here, and I started to realize that this is actually very unpleasant for white. You know, black is pretty much just going to bring the knight to d5 and has very good chances to hold the game. White is still better, of course, but black has definitely accomplished something. So I spent a very long time here trying to salvage the situation. I was trying to think about like, okay, maybe I can go rook a1, for example, and just try to go after this pawn. But after b5, taking advantage of this pin, I don't think this has really helped white very much. After king e3, knight c7, these are all moves that black wants to play anyway. So all we've really done is make our own rook worse. I also considered, rook a1, b5 with the idea of going king e1, just trying to evict the rook this way, and then maybe going rook c1 to trade it off, and arguing that the two bishops control this pawn very well. But I didn't really see how to collect these pawns very well. If again, just knight c7 and back to c6, rook c1, takes. I thought that black is probably doing kind of okay here, either with just, king f7 or something, but also b4, and trying to liquidate this pawn immediately looked pretty annoying. So eventually I decided that, okay, fine, we bungled a little bit of the advantage, but we should still be much better after king e3, so let's just do that. Knight c7, king d3, forcing the rook off of the very active square of c2. Rook c6, and then king e4, intending just f4, f5, and opening the position for the bishops. I probably should have started with f4 in hindsight, because after king e4, black can maybe play g5 to try to slow the pawns down a little bit. But we reached pretty much the same position anyway. My opponent played bishop f8, f4, and now f5 is coming, after which white should have very, very good chances again. My opponent played king f7, I played f5, we traded twice, and my opponent played knight e6. I think this was probably a pretty critical moment here. I spent a lot of time trying to decide between bishop e3 and bishop f2. There are some benefits and downsides to both. One is, like, the main point of bishop f2 is now we're starting to go bishop h5, and after king e7, we have this check available on h4. The point being that, if the bishop is on e3, then we don't have a check on g5 anymore. But now, after bishop h5, we're actually forcing the king pretty far away, which should help the winning chances considerably. But I was having a lot of trouble dealing with rook c2 here, and then after bishop h5, just going back to g8, for example. Now, black is starting to play knight g7, which forks the king and the bishop. So we don't really have time to just move this bishop somewhere. If we could move this bishop to h4 and then to f6, maybe it would be good. But basically we have to take on e6, and after takes, I don't think this should be winning for white. Most likely we'll get the piece, but black is going to collect all of the pawns in the meantime. So eventually I rejected bishop f2, and decided to go for bishop e3 instead. I think probably the correct move was neither of these two things. My initial instinct was, obviously we'd like the bishop on c3, that's the absolute best square. Controls this rook entirely, opens up rook d7, still opens up a check with bishop h5 and king e7, so it kind of achieves the same thing as bishop f2. But I got scared of a3 again, and I think I missed just this very simple idea that we can hold this pawn from the front instead of the back. And now after takes, bishop takes, there is no rook c2 anymore, forking the bishops, because this rook is actually defending the bishop from the side, and actually we're also checkmating black, which is a nice bonus. So there's no real reason to be afraid of a3, and if there's no reason to be afraid of a3, I should just go bishop c3, which is probably just winning on the spot. But instead I played this pretty bad move, bishop e3, and now it becomes very, very difficult again, because my opponent found this very nice move, bishop c5, and I realized that I'm actually going to have a lot of difficulty winning this position. I mostly looked only at rook c2, and then I saw this kind of nice idea with rook d7. If king e8 takes, now we can take on b7, and this bishop is untouchable because of the mate threat, at which point the e-pawn can just run, and we are probably winning very comfortably here. But my opponent found bishop c5, and then I just couldn't find a good way to convert this at all. Maybe there's no way to convert it. Maybe black is already fine. But my solution was definitely really bad. What I did should have allowed black to escape with a draw very, very easily. I went ahead and took on c5. Now black has to take with the knight. Black takes with the rook. Then we have rook d7, and the knight falls. So my opponent took on c5 with the knight, and my idea here was to give check and play rook g1, getting into the 7th rank another way. And at this point, like, I kind of stopped calculating here because I just kind of assumed, like, once the rook gets to the 7th rank, like, we probably win. But I didn't quite miss, but I underestimated the strength substantially of black just playing rook h6 here, holding the b7 pawn is already held by the knight, the h7 pawn is now held by the rook, and this king is actually doing a great job of holding this pawn at bay. After rook g7, my opponent played king d8, and now the main problem for white is if we do go for e6, which I just kind of assumed would be winning, you know, we're assuming e7, white is planning to play e7 and bishop d5 and make a queen. Black has this very annoying move rook h5, and I don't think white has a good way into the position anymore. You know, we would like to, if we go like king g4, for example, then black holds the pawn from the back. And if we go king f4, then black just goes ahead and takes his bishop, and now this pawn is no longer dangerous. So we would actually have to go forward to f6, which isn't that bad, you know, we should be quite happy to do that. But after knight e4, king f7, you know, black has probably a few different solutions here, but the easiest is probably knight d6. White can't go back to f6 because of knight e8. And if white continues going forward, then once again, black gives a check and just collects this bishop g8 as well, sort of the same problem. So white can't go e6 for these very concrete tactical reasons, which is what I kind of overlooked when I was calculating his position initially, which means that we have to try to force the king away first, which I did, and only now go for e6. Now the king can like go to e7 if black gives a lot of checks. This is still probably what black should do because knight d6, even without it being a fork, still threatens like knight f5 as well. And so bishop d3 is kind of forced, and then black can just go ahead and take. White will probably manage to make a queen, but it's not gonna be enough to win at the very best. White will get rook and bishop versus rook, but probably won't even get that. But my opponent decided to just, you know, end the game immediately and go ahead and take on e6, which is also fine as a defense. I think he probably underestimated his position a little bit. And now after takes, we cannot hold the b2 pawn, so once again, the absolute best we're getting is going to be rook and bishop versus rook. And after bishop d7, king c5 takes on e4. Black, of course, can just take on b2, take on h7, and then most likely we're not even going to pick up this pawn. If we do, I think I would actually, in practice, win this more often than not. It's actually really quite difficult to hold this endgame if you haven't looked at it with like somewhat recently, and realistically, I doubt my opponent has. So I was fairly comfortable being like, okay, you know, fine, we'll go to this endgame. I blew it a little bit, but the odds I win this endgame are still probably like around 50%, I would say. Mostly depending on whether I can pick up the b pawn naturally or not, which I think is possible to likely. But my opponent decided to throw in b5, which is fine, but relies on some tactical stuff. Of course, I can play bishop d1, which I assume is what he expected, and then this is maybe a slightly better version of the position than before. I don't really think it is, to be honest. I think, you know, obviously we can get the same position after takes b5 immediately, and then bishop d1, so he hasn't really gained anything by doing it. And in fact, I probably should play bishop d1 here, but I decided that, I kind of blundered, I guess, is maybe a better way of putting it, because I didn't see his idea here. So I went ahead and played rook c7, thinking that he had actually blundered with b5, and I was probably winning now. Because now we're going to put something on c2, is the idea, with this intermediate check, and we are going to preserve the b-pawn and then win the game. What I missed here, and what my opponent fortunately also missed, is that black has this really nice idea to trap the bishop, which is just to go back to b6. The rook is attacked, so rook c2 is forced. And now the only square for the bishop is b3. The bishop is still attacked, so black can very comfortably just take away that square and regain the piece with a very, very easy draw. Unfortunately, my opponent overlooked this and played king b4 instead in time pressure, and now after bishop c2, this pawn is preserved, and the rest is fairly easy. We bring the king back to free up the rook, which we then can put behind the pawn. Go ahead and play rook h5 just to put pressure here. And now, we are forcing black's king out. This pawn is now very powerful, and we can just go ahead and load up on this pawn to end the game, which is pretty much what happened. My opponent went ahead and played this out a bit, but here he decided that he had had enough. So overall, this was definitely a pretty sloppy win objectively, but I actually felt kind of okay about this one. I definitely felt like I had played the opening well. This is probably the first game of the tournament where I knew the opening better than my opponent did. And that definitely showed. So I gained a lot of time on the clock in the opening, and that ended up being quite relevant later. My conversion after I got the winning position was obviously very, very sloppy. I could have even lost the endgame, honestly. Like, it's not guaranteed that, I think in low time from, this position where he took on e6, I think if he just played, check in 94 and 96 and stuff, it's actually probably easier to play black, because you'll end up with, a rook and 3 pawns against rook and bishop or something, and there's not a lot to think about as black. You just move your pawns forward. If they drop, fine, you just defend rook against rook and bishop. But white actually has to be very careful not to allow them to go too far. So I think it was very, very possible that I could lose this endgame. But I think I did a good job of keeping chances alive here. There are a few places that I could have bailed out. For example, even here, if my opponent went back to e7, maybe we even repeat. If I got really scared, I probably wouldn't. I'd probably figure out something else to do. But I think I did a good job of at least giving my opponent enough chances to make some mistakes. And partially that's because I'm stupid and didn't realize that what I was doing was dumb. But it did give my opponent just enough rope to get himself into trouble, basically. So I thought I played okay. It's definitely not one of my better games, but it wasn't particularly egregious either. In 90-30, you expect there to be some mistakes, and I had plenty of those. So I was okay with it, especially because the result was obviously good. Winning the game is good for several reasons. First of all, we're almost back to even here. Maybe still a small minus, but 3 out of 4, even against much lower rated players, is never going to be that bad. And we would earn ourselves a sort of a real game the next round against probably one of the few grandmasters in the tournament. So overall, reasonably happy. Could have definitely been better, but definitely could have been worse as well. And so I wanted to make sure, especially since this game was a very long one, we went pretty much down to the wire time-wise, that I had some time to prepare for what was probably going to be the critical game of the event coming up in the next round, and as we'll see, it was. It was a very, very interesting game, but we'll talk about that next time, and I will see you all for round 5. Thank you all for watching.